Hello, this is Jacqueline Hanna. I'm the Assistant Director of Food Co-op Initiative, and thank you for joining us today for volunteer recruitment and retention. Keep them coming back for more. We're going to have a guest speaker today, Bonnie Hudspeth from the neighboring Food Co-op Association. Just a little bit about Food Co-op Initiative before we get started. We are a nonprofit that nationally serves food co-ops that are trying to start up in communities all across the country. We have helped in our 10 years of existence, 130 food co-ops opening. We are celebrating our 10th year and launching into our second decade, and are currently providing support and resources for 120 communities nationwide, from Sitka, Alaska to Boston, Massachusetts. We exist to support startup food co-ops at any stage of development. If you're thinking about the possibility of starting a food co-op, or you're opening your doors in a couple months, anywhere along that process, we can help. Our number is here on the screen, as well as our email, and all of our services are free. So feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to help. Also, check out our website at www.foodcoopinitiative.coop. There we have a bunch of additional free resources, workbooks, and webinars. We'd like to thank our sponsors, the USDA, National Cooperative Bank, National Cooperative Grocers, Blooming Prairie Foundation, and dozens of mature food co-ops all over the United States. They make it possible to do what we do as a nonprofit to support startups all over the country. Thank you. A few quick points of housekeeping today. No, you're going to cut this slide, Joel, when you take this apart. I forgot that doesn't belong in here. Okay, so skipping that slide. Okay, well, our program today is volunteer recruitment and retention, a important issue all the way from stage 1 development through stage 3. And we are very lucky to have with us today Bonnie Hudspeth from neighboring Food Co-op Association, who not only works with that organization, but has been the project manager to open a very successful startup food co-op herself. So I'm going to introduce Bonnie Hudspeth.
Hey, everybody. Here. As Jacqueline mentioned, managing volunteers and figuring out where to find them and keep them for the co-op organizing ride is such a crucial part of the success of your food co-op. And so today I was going to talk to you a little bit about how do you even think about planning for volunteer recruitment? How do you assess your volunteers to match them with their skills and the needs of the co-op? And then how do you go about training your volunteers? And once you have your volunteers, how do you keep them? And you know, we're not going to do questions right now, but my information is at the end of the slides, and so feel free to contact me with questions if you have any follow-up questions. So Jacqueline mentioned that, you know, I started out in this whole journey by being a happy co-op shopper. I like to just shop at the local food co-op. I grew up in Burlington, Vermont, and shopped at City Market, grew up there, visiting it regularly. And so when I moved to Keene, New Hampshire, and there was not a food co-op, I inadvertently became the project manager and worked for 4 years to help organize the Monadnock food co-op, which opened 3 years ago, I believe. And so through that process, I got a lot of experience with all of the pre-operational development in starting a food co-op, like setting up the board, the governance, and also doing a lot of the pre-operations organizing for fundraising and member loan campaigns, et cetera. So I got lots of great experience. And now I'm lucky enough to work for a regional association of food co-ops around New England. So you can see a map here where we have over 35 food co-ops and startups that are collectively owned by over 100,000 people in New England. And we're working together toward the same vision of a healthy, thriving regional economy. And so it's really one of the great parts of working for this association is that we have over 10 startups in addition to all the established food co-ops. So they're able to learn and connect with each other. And that, you know, it's been great to have people and coordinate them in terms of learning from each other, and also the startups learning from the established co-ops and vice versa. So I know this seems silly, but we all get overwhelmed with what we have to accomplish, and sometimes it's hard to take a step back. when you're thinking about your volunteer recruitment. And consider, do you like to get food when you're volunteering during meal times? Do you have a clear idea of, do you like to have a clear idea of what you're doing and how it fits into the success of a project or organization? Do you like to be thanked when you volunteer? You know, thinking through when you're starting this, how do you like to be treated when you volunteered for other places? And then also, what was your best experience as a volunteer and what made that your best experience? And then, almost more importantly, what was your worst experience? What made you volunteer for an organization and then never go back? And how can you learn from that? So get yourself into that volunteer recruitment mindset by asking yourself those questions and asking your board members or your staff those questions. Then, once you thought about that, think about, how do we set ourselves up well so that we're able to be really clear with volunteers on what we need? So by having a clear vision of first of all, who you are, who is your group as a startup, and then what are you wanting from the volunteers, offering very clear expectations and identifying your needs. This is where we really need you. Can you help out? So one of the first things I think that is helpful is creating a volunteer plan with whoever it is that oversees volunteers from your co-op, whether it's a staff member or a board member, and then building up your base of volunteers so that your entire startup organizing process. So that means sign-up sheets at every single event, tabling, potluck, meeting that you do, a checkbox on your membership brochure and website to sign up for volunteering, and also that you have build a shared database of volunteers from the very beginning, even if it's Google Docs that multiple people can do. And one thing that I will say is helpful that I didn't realize for a while when trying to find good volunteers is that one of the most important volunteer skill sets you can tap into is community organizing, people that have community organizing skills. So if you don't know community organizers, try to find them as some of your first volunteers, committee heads, or maybe even someone to oversee your volunteers and help you manage your volunteers. Community organizers are rock stars at volunteer management. So a little bit more about this volunteer plan. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but the more you can strategically plan about your volunteer needs and how they relate to your development timeline, the easier it will be to retain appropriate volunteers for each stage. So if you're using the 4 cornerstones and 3 stages model, hint, hint, that's very helpful. You can create a volunteer management team and committee that helps to think about, okay, first, who is going to manage your volunteers and what are our needs during each stage of development, and think this through in advance. That's going to then help you think about, well, what types of skills do we need during each stage? What are the types of volunteers we need to recruit? So once you have this volunteer management team together, work with a team to create a plan, like what needs to get done, what is board work versus staff work if you already have a staff member versus volunteer work, what's your recruitment plan? So some basic things. And make sure that everyone knows this, make sure it's shared with the board, and so everyone is clear with volunteer recruitment and management. Because I will be honest, recruiting volunteers is challenging, and holding volunteers accountable is challenging. It is like wrestling an alligator often. But it's a really important part of startup development because you don't have staff. I mean, you might have one staff, but if you are that staff person, you have no one else. And the co-op is not going to get open unless you have successful volunteers. So putting the time and effort into this work is really crucial. And as I mentioned, strategically planning sounds like a pain. And it is a lot of work, but the more you can do up front, the better you're going to set yourself up for success. And it takes a while to build your volunteer base up. So start yesterday and keep working on it.
I've got a question for you, Bonnie. This is Jacqueline. Interject for a second.
Sure.
One of the questions that we hear a lot that come up is that when putting together that plan, they're like, well, how many hours will we need? How many volunteer hours will we need per phase? And we have a hard time supporting that because it doesn't seem the right way to look at it, even though that information would be so useful. How does that plan evolve? How do you start with any assumption about how many people you're going to need?
That's a great question. You know, I would have a hard time answering that as well, a big picture, but one thing I would think of is I'll talk a little bit about job descriptions for your volunteers. And a really important component of job descriptions is time involved, because you want to be really realistic with each volunteer about how much you're asking them to commit. And that's really important. And so it's more like once you understand what what volunteer tasks are and what you need volunteers to do, once you go to the part of putting together volunteer job descriptions, that's gonna require you to estimate, well, how many hours do we need each week of someone coming into the co-op office and entering data into the database? Okay, probably 3. And so then I would just start a running list, and maybe you have an idea of estimates right off the bat. But if you estimate time needed with each job, I think that's a helpful way to do it, because it's really going to vary. You know, some volunteers you'll need to do tabling once, or they might say, I'll do a one-off, I'll go table at the farmer's market, and then you'll never see me again. And so I think just having that list and tying the hours specifically to job descriptions, which I'm going to talk about and are super important, I think that might be the best strategy.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yep. So during each stage of development, where you're going to find volunteers might differ. And so I tried to put together a couple examples just to get your brainstorming started. This might be different for your community, but the reality is that most volunteers, you'll be lucky if you keep them for 3 months. So what does that mean? Plan for turnover. And it also means you're really going to want to find those amazing volunteers that are going to be with you for the long haul. And so just a couple of examples. In stage 1, you can find volunteers in every place with people who want to co-op. You're going to have this is where you want to just like build the crap out of your database, right? Get a bunch of people, anyone that's interested, put them in that database, because they might not show up until you're open the doors of your co-op and training them to be greeters, but it doesn't matter. You want to build that database up early. And so you can find them at daycares, farmers markets, community festivals, nutritionists. For committee chairs, heads of nonprofits are great, social workers, community organizers, teachers, people that love order and know how to run a good meeting are really important for chairing your committees up. So then when you're thinking about stage 2, your focus is more on, well, who's going to help us get our project funded? So for this, what I found was really helpful was having connectors, long-term community leaders who are well connected. That means they're probably not going to move. They're not going anywhere. Those will probably be the volunteers that you retain, to be honest, for much longer than 3 months. And if this takes you 4 years, hopefully for at least 3 of those. So, city planners, financial planners, HR staff, someone that works for the Chamber of Commerce, business owners, these are just a couple of examples. Then you think about shifting into stage 3. Woohoo, you've overcome all these obstacles of the first 2 stages. So, it's really going to be similar types of volunteers for stage 2, but you'll also want to tap back into that community outreach focus, because you want to get people ready to shop, right? So, greeters, stalkers, spreading the buzz, you'll want to tap back into people that might not have been involved in the organizing, the volunteer office work, because it might not feel sexy to them, but they once the store is closer to opening, they're ready to be engaged again.
I love your point about what you need in stage 2. It's something we've noticed too, but never really pulled out, which is, when you're getting close to asking for money, when you're getting close to your owner financing campaign, that people who have not been in the community long, people who are not well rooted in the community, don't end up being trusted voices when money gets involved. When we're talking about something that's going to be here for a long time, and that they look like they might not likely be a part of. So I thought that was really an excellent point about stage 2. Great.
And I didn't say it. I saved this for the last slide as a huge take-home point. But and this might sound harsh, but avoid college students unless you have very specific tasks for them. You can find some amazing volunteers that are college students, but do not put them as your committee chairs. Because for certain roles, where you do not want turnover, you want people that are rooted in the community and that are not likely to be moving. So I just am bringing that up because I spent so much time going out to local college classes when I was project manager and recruiting volunteers that then it took me much more time to manage them. They often fell through and were not tended to not be reliable for, for obvious reasons. They were incredibly busy. So that was an aha moment for me. Is college students are great for certain things, for setting up a survey for all their teachers, right? Who will be shoppers at the co-op, even for their surveying stuff is great. But beyond that, I've found that they tend to be, it just creates a lot of turnover if you put them on committees or something like that.
I didn't mean to press you into that right away, but that has been our experience as well, and we find a lot of groups really resist hearing that knowledge. So I did not pay her to say that, but we've really seen that repeatedly. Even groups have said, "Oh, it's been great. We got an intern," and that's great if they're doing data entry, maybe a few small events, tabling, that sort of thing. But many, again and again, what we hear is that if we put them in charge of communications, social media, these are some places they're often attracted. Campaign running, that just doesn't work. It either falls apart, they don't come through, they can't get their voice aligned with the co-op and the community because they don't know it very well, and or you just run into people don't know who they are, and so the people who are going to glom onto what you're doing as a co-op and really get it and are going to be people who want to better their community, and they just don't see faces of people who are probably not going to be there in a year or two as someone they trust with a conversation about how to improve their community.
Yeah, that really is a great point. And I think you'll save yourself some trouble by thinking, if you want to engage your college students, think very strategically about how to use them. So now you've built up your list, right? You should have, depending on where you are, 50, 60, if you're lucky, 70 volunteers, like a huge database. So how do you get them to actually do stuff? Like, how do you get them to commit to stuff? Because, we've all sent out calls for volunteers in our emails, right? We put them on Facebook, and you might attract some high achievers, people that have time on their hands. They really want to volunteer. The co-op is really resonating with them, but probably not a huge amount, especially if your board is already built up, right? You've already done that outreach in the community and started to, your most important volunteers are your board members. And so you've already put them together. How do you get other people? Yeah, pick up the phone. I hate talking on the phone. I was nervous as heck to pick up the phone and call people. And I had to overcome it because I realized it is such an effective tool. Besides meeting in person, calling is the most effective way to get your volunteers to commit to doing something. It's much easier to say no to an email, right? Or to Facebook. So then getting a direct ask from someone in your community, that, especially if you see them on the street, right? So how, you can call them first to recruit them. If you have a big event coming up, call them to mobilize them. At the beginning, when our volunteer list was 30, it was easy to call through all of them. And so before important public events, like you have a city council hearing coming up, call every single one of your freaking volunteers and get them to show up with signs in support of giving you an appropriation for your feasibility study. That makes a huge impression on the city council and will be very helpful when you get back to the planning, license, and development stage for your store, right? For group photos or groundbreaking ribbon cutting, you can put notices out on Facebook, and use your other channels of communication. But if you want the co-op to not look lame and have 5 people standing around at your groundbreaking, it's worth calling. That's something that I would do a call for. And once you have even a small amount of volunteers, you can get your volunteers to call. And, the member loan campaign, you're obviously going to be doing lots of calls. So it's helpful to have people that are trained in calling anyway. And I would say big milestones, like your first member owner target celebration, which is usually 500 member owners. You could do 300. That's an opportunity to call people, especially if it's, or maybe 600, if it's kind of the precursor to launching your capital campaign. You want people to be there, you want to update them, and you also, so that's an example of when I would call through volunteers to mobilize them. And that's like, these calls are fun. It's not like doing political calls. Most of the people you're going to talk to are going to be incredibly fun to talk to. They're going to be like, whoa, the co-op is calling me, right? They're going to be super excited because they probably aren't expecting it. And one thing that we can do is really helpful is putting together call scripts. I put together one example script that I sent to Jacqueline. So she's going to post it on FCI's website so that you can reference it. And that's by no means perfect. It's kind of cheesy, but it's if you're feeling like you need somewhere to start, it's a starting point. Okay, so you're calling your volunteers, you're mobilizing them, and you're getting them to show up for something. So one thing, that's really, really crucial to using your volunteers well and retaining them is making sure that you assess them and figure out how you can match their interests and skills with the work that needs to be done. This is really time consuming sometimes, and a really time consuming way, but one of the best ways is having one-on-one meetings or coffee shop conversations is what I call them. So short meetings where you're finding out more about them, you're asking them lots of questions, and then at the very end, you're like, hey, this is how you fit into this project. This is how, this is how we need you. And so if you're not familiar with one-on-one trainings or one-on-one meetings, Google it. Ideally talk to a community organizer who knows how to do them well. If you're looking for committee chairs or board members, one-on-one meetings are awesome. They do take time. It means you sitting down with people, setting up meetings, and finding the right people to have these meetings with. So for your other volunteers, doing surveys on sign-up sheets is really an easy way to assess their interests. And you'll probably have to update those maybe once or twice, maybe 3 times a year, depending on how your needs changed. So you might put different questions on that you're surveying them about, depending on what you need. Do you need letters to the editor? You always need people to write letters to the editor. So yes, put that on there. But meaning at different stages, you'll probably need to revise these surveys. Mm-hmm. Also volunteer trainings, and I'll tell you, I'll go through a little bit of a story about a volunteer training. And how you can use those to assess volunteers. And then volunteer job descriptions with time commitment. Woo! This is great. So that's another thing, right? It's upfront energy investment, but in your work job, right? You need to know what you're doing. It's going to be really helpful to you. So it's well worth the investment. Okay, so this is a tale of a volunteer training that we did. And I'm going to use it with Monadnock Food Co-op. I'm going to use it as an example. And it was very successful. It took a lot of time up front. This is something that you might do once in your entire co-op organizing, because that's all we did. We did once and then we did a similar thing. But it takes a lot of investment. But it was a way to really reach out to our volunteers. We got tons of people there. We got member owners to join. And then we were able to leave the event with 30 more active volunteers than when we started out. So it was well worth it. So, you think first about how do you get people's attention that this is happening? You want to send an invite email to your entire subscriber list and to your volunteer list, like 1 month in advance or more, about this training. You want to put a press release in your newspaper. You want to do as much press as possible. You want to list it under the events. You want to make it look fun. Would I choose to do a worm with a shovel again? Probably not. But this is an example of what we did, kind of like who, what, when, where, why. Who should attend? People who are interested in putting their talents to use and getting our co-op open. So you want it to sound fun and inspirational. And then flyers around town. Might as well, right? Get the word out there as much as possible. And then you also ideally would call through your volunteer list, right? If you're trying to recruit and build up your volunteers through this and fill your committees, which is often to keep those committees filled with the right people, it might be worth calling through your volunteer list. And if you I'm assuming you're having a couple volunteers, so get them to help you call through your volunteer list. The way a community organizer would do it would be to call through the list 2 weeks in advance, a week in advance, and the night before, all different messaging. That seems nearly impossible, right? I don't think we ever did that. The only time we did that density of calls was for our member loan campaign, but I'm just letting you know, like, that's what community organizers will do if they're having an event. So if you're gonna do one call, you might wanna do 2 weeks in advance, just so you get people to know. The night before calls, if you can get those done, is just like, hey, we'd like to could you bring cookies to the event tomorrow? It's more like giving an excuse to call them, just to remind them about the event, and it increases turnout.
Now, this is really cool to me, Bonnie, because what we see a lot of startups do is offer kind of a volunteer training kind of at random times, and they're not organized and treated and promoted like their big events, like their fall harvest festival, or whatever their big splashy event is. And this is unique in that I've only seen you and one or two other startups do this, where they really treat the volunteer training as a big end in of itself, like a big fun event you're going to want to be part of, that we're going to spend a lot of energy promoting. And so I just want to put in there that this model seems to really work much more effectively than having to put on the training 4 or 5 times a year and having 2 people show up.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we did this was in December, so end of the year, which was probably helpful in terms of getting, we did it early December, and we did it a middle of the week night to try to get as many people as possible. And that was probably, that year, we probably didn't do any other big events. So we really I got together a planning committee of 4 people to put this event together. And one of them ended up, I was able to harass her to be a volunteer coordinator in the end, because she realized that she liked training, preparing the training and helping write the job descriptions and doing all these pieces. So it was well worth making this one of the big events. And it was also a way to educate people. If you're going to have a co-op information meeting where you're giving updates to the community anyway, that was one of the major things we did with the volunteer training. As project manager, I spent 30 minutes going through, here's our updates, here's our mission and vision, going over all the stuff that you need to tell everyone 500 times. And then this is why you're an important piece of it. So I'll share a couple of examples. So, to prepare in advance, you're going to want detailed sign-up sheets. So more detailed maybe than just at an event, where you're going to ask them to check off. Like, I think at this one, we were like, as a follow-up, we're like, you're not walking out the door without committing to doing something. That was very clear. So we thought of 3 things that we asked them to do, like write a letter to the editor, show up at the next X event that we knew was on the horizon, something else like that. So think about, you want the sign-up sheets as detailed as possible to gather additional information maybe. And then you want to make sure you have volunteer job descriptions for the major volunteer roles you are aware of. And you can always do more in the future. But before your training, you should have ideas of what you're going to be recruiting people specifically for, because you're going to do some matchmaking the night of. Having interactive training activities for the training, that was one of the things that I wasn't so into it when we were putting it together, but it ended up being, it got people on their feet. They were smiling, they were laughing, they were excited. We got them, it was like, one of the activities was super simple. It was like, if you love talking to people, go to this end of the room. And there were 70 people there, right? So watching 70 people walk, like get into the right space was kind of funny. So if you like data entry, and then people would laugh because they either loved it or they hated it, right? So just doing a couple interactive activities where people are standing up and kind of mingling with each other, that was, even if you do 1 or 2, I think it's really helpful. Make sure you have food. Feeding volunteers is important. Ask any community organizer. We were lucky because we had some neighboring food co-ops around us that we could ask to donate, and look at what this picture is Putney Food Co-op and Brattleboro Food Co-op teamed up and put together an insane spread that we totally didn't expect. I was thinking like pizza, right? Most pizza and drinks. But if you can ask your volunteers to bring stuff, that's a great way to engage them. And a lot of people love cooking.
We've also seen local businesses really love the opportunity to promote their support of the co-op by putting together a nice spread for many startups. So don't be afraid to ask some of your local businesses.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. So when you have these volunteers, this is an example of the volunteer sign-up sheet that we had for the training. So understanding what your volunteers are interested in is really one of the keys to volunteer retention, because it's going to keep them engaged, they like what they're doing, and it's going to also help them better put their skills to use, so they're going to be more effective for the co-op. So total win-win. So you want to evaluate their interest and include direct asks, such as write a letter to the editor, attend a co-op event, help with fundraising, talk to friends and neighbors about joining. So you can see the little check boxes there we had on the event. It could be even more detailed than this, but this is the one we chose for the event. It was a full page. You could probably figure out how to do it on a half page, but we wanted every bit of information we could squeeze out of these people, because if they showed up at a volunteer training, good. likelihood we'd be able to get them to continue to be volunteers. So this is just an example of categories you might consider for putting into your job descriptions. I don't have to go through all of them, but notice, the title, purpose, location, key responsibilities, qualifications. Qualifications, you don't really need to get too detailed, but if you want someone to be a committee chair, you want to know that they're good at facilitating meetings. And if everyone used these if you had these in advance, I feel like the startup organizing would be so much more efficient, because it is really, you do not want someone ending up in the wrong role, because then you're going to often, as a volunteer manager, spend so much of your time fighting with them to either help push them and teach them the skills that they don't have, or they're going to be super uncomfortable and maybe not communicate that with you and not really be doing a good job. So having some sort of qualification related to the purpose of the role, the job that the volunteer will be doing, I think is really helpful. Who they report to, that helps them understand this too. It helps them understand the organizational structure, another opportunity to educate. And then anticipated weekly time commitment, that's great. And even if you're totally off, it's really good to brainstorm with a couple other folks, how much time do we think you need? And so these are just a couple examples of categories you can consider putting on your job descriptions. Okay, so what's the agenda for your volunteer training? One thing I think that was really important, well, the most important thing, I'll just tell you right off the bat, is the ask. It's the most important reason for the event. People do not walk out the door without a commitment to a specific job on a specific timeline. If you do not have a deadline, it's gonna be very hard to hold them accountable. And if you're shy about directly asking people, you better start practicing, because I'm a fairly non-confrontational person. Well, at least I was when I first started co-op organizing, but you really have to work through your shyness. You've been called by a political organizer, you know what that feels like, right? They're going to directly ask you to do something, and if they're a good organizer, they're going to call you back and harass you until they get you to follow through and commit, or say a direct no. That's what you want to, that's the framework you want to use for your ask of the people that show up to your volunteer training. They've taken time out of their day, they've sacrificed a lot to get there, they're committed, and they want to be asked to do something. So then now, the rest of the training. I think it's really important to give a little bit of history and context of the co-op movement. What is the co-op? What will our co-op be like? Get people kind of excited about thinking about the store. Go through frequently asked questions. That's really helpful because it helps them be ambassadors. You want them to be able to leave this and to be able to answer these questions in the community themselves. So going over mission and vision, even if you assume they know, they probably don't. And if it's not in an elevator pitch format where it's really easy to hear, work on refining it so that it's really easy for someone to repeat in a couple sentences, or ideally one sentence. How do we get there? Share your timeline for opening and how the volunteers fit in, and then also why you are important. But the volunteers need to know, and they want to be important. And then the activity, line people up and break into small groups that I mentioned before. Then before this, know what your ask is, right? So you want to have that ask ready, whether it's joining, getting 5 friends to join. There will be people at this event that are not member owners, so you want to get them to join before they leave. Sorry, I'm a little sick. All right. So as part of your volunteer training, it's, some of the things on this agenda, sharing all the work the board and staff have been doing is really important. You want to bring volunteers along for the ride, because they will then be better prepared to share info with their networks and the community, and you want them to feel like they have an integral role in the success of the project, because they do. You will not open without a good network of volunteers. And so if you think a little bit about sharing with the volunteers, making it explicit to them where they fit in, because sometimes they might just table at one farmer's market and not really understand and not understand a sense of purpose. So it's important that they feel a sense of purpose, whether they're your super worker, your co-op office super worker, stuffing envelopes, whether they're leading presentations in the community, they, if you can educate them through frequently asked questions for these presentations about who owns the co-op, how the co-op will benefit not only member owners, but the whole community, and then help them refine their story, why you joined, get them to say, this is why I joined. And if they do not have a powerful story, another activity that's important for volunteer trainings we're doing role play is really great, is having people practice why you joined, sharing why you joined. Because that, as project manager, my story was refined over time. And when my story really gelled was when I noticed I got other people to join much more efficiently. So that the story is a really important piece. And, I know a couple of the startups that I am helping to support have trouble retaining volunteers because they don't see their role in the co-op organizing as important. So making sure you spell it out. And even if you're teaching them to flip their friends from I'll join when you open to understanding we open when you join, if a volunteer can understand that themselves and then put that into action and help shift the community conversation, it's well worth that time invested. Volunteers want to help, so ask them to help and offer them various engagement opportunities. So when, as part of this training, maybe their one role is hosting co-op potluck. They don't have time to do things weekly, but they can get their friends in one room and they can say, this is why I joined, I want you to join. Maybe they like busy work and just love to come in and do office tasks. And, or maybe they're gonna be your best ambassadors. They love talking to people. They're chatty Cathys. They know everyone in the community. They love gossip. They love getting together with their friends. Get them to get 100 of their friends to join, right? There's certain people that really, that got, I would say, at least 30 of their friends to join. That's rare, but in our case, one of the, someone who worked for the Chamber of Commerce knew everyone and their brother. You want to meet that person and get them to empower them and educate them about the co-op and get them to start talking and asking their friends. And they typically will not be shy about asking their friends to join and even pressuring their friends to join, which is wonderful.
I love that you mentioned that, because I think a lot of startups, unless you yourself or someone on your board is that kind of person, someone who will probably get 20 to 30 people to join all by themselves or more, you may not realize that that's not an unreasonable ask. I love this idea of outlining all these possible ways you could commit today, and don't be afraid to throw out there, we're looking for a couple super ambassadors that can get 10 or more owners, because we see that personality pop up eventually in almost every startup, whether it ends up on the board or just in the volunteers. But I see a lot of boards assume like, oh, because I'm not good at X, and it could be any of these volunteer responsibilities, no one else is going to want to do that. And I love that Bonnie has a list here for you, because don't assume any of the things on these lists, if they make you terribly uncomfortable, isn't something that someone else would go, oh, that's me. And so don't limit yourself on what you ask based on what you're comfortable doing.
Yeah, thanks. And that's, what's funny is that at our volunteer training, we had one of the groups that we were recruiting for was you called them super ambassadors. That's exactly what we called them. We're like, super ambassador, who wants to be that? And that, for one of the groups, there was like 20 or 30 people in them. That group had 3 or 4 people, but they knew it was like, maybe it was more of a rare skill set, but they knew they wanted to be out in the community. They wanted to be the tablers. They wanted to present in front of 50 people. They wanted to be talking. And so they loved that. And so, thinking about this whole volunteer training, over 75 people showed up to the training. We got 15 new members from this volunteer info session training, and we retained a bunch of new volunteers. So it was really high investment compared to, most events are really high investment, but it was well worth putting all those planning materials together, because you really need them anyway, right? But we didn't have volunteer job descriptions until we prepared to do this training, and it really kicked us to do a lot of the things that we should have done earlier. So if for no other reason, throw this huge event to make yourself put stuff into action so that you'll be better at recruiting and managing and retaining your volunteers. So that, wrapping up here, retaining your volunteers, I talked about a couple things. Like, part of what you're doing is the assessment, right? You're identifying their needs and their skills and interests, and you're linking people both based on motivation and self-interest. So they're actually doing work that they want to do. You're also asking them, what do you want to get out of this? Because that's a really important thing to know. Like for some volunteers, they might just say, I want this co-op to open. I don't need anything from it. I just want to do everything I can to make this co-op open. But for others, they'll be like, well, I want this as a time to meet other cool people in the community. I'm new to the community. We had a lot of people like that were volunteers. Or I want to increase my skill set in these areas. Like people learned a lot through volunteering, especially the board members, right? But committee chairs learned a lot in doing this. So knowing what they want to get out of this so that you as a volunteer manager, whoever that is for your co-op, can understand and better respond and help make sure that they're in the right role is really important. This is all, most of volunteer management is building relationships, right? And relationship management. So if you as a volunteer manager show a willingness to listen and demonstrate, you're really demonstrating the value of a co-op community, what that can be like. And it will make them want to keep volunteering, more likely to. And, you know, I said, ask them, what do you want to get in this? But having regular check-ins with volunteers to see how things are going is important. And that's part of that relationship building, because they might have missed the last meeting because they had a death in their family. And so the more that you can build those relationships and check in, and I know it's really hard because you're so overwhelmed. There's a million things to do. And sometimes if someone walks into your office, you want to just like shove a stack of envelopes in front of their face and be like, get to work, an hour, get these done. But having that, you know, talking with them, chatting with them, and building those relationships is really crucial in helping retain them. And that goes right in line with creating a positive organizational culture. You want to give them realistic tasks so that they can actually complete the tasks and succeed and feel good about themselves. And so that you can be good. You know, you can feel good as a volunteer manager that you've set out realistic tasks, and you're you know, that might take you might have some hiccups, and that might take a couple lessons learned, and then you'll get better at it as a volunteer manager. Also, empower volunteers. You know, as a volunteer, sometimes people are never asked their ideas, opinions, or thoughts. I used my volunteers all the time as project manager because they had incredible ideas. They're incredibly innovative, and they also brought a different perspective. They weren't thinking about the co-op 24/7 like I was. They were more able to think like another community member that knew very little or you know, not too much about the details of the co-op. And so I found it was really important to ask them, hey, add in your ideas. What do you think we should do this? This is what I was thinking. How does it sound to you? Use them as your sounding board. And one of the most important things in volunteer retention is thank your volunteers. Thank them by email, call them out in your newsletters, post their pictures on Facebook if they'll let you, on your website. Shining a light on the volunteers in the community is a really effective way. I know Green Top Grocery did a great job of that during their capital campaign, and it really is. It feels very nice to be thanked when you're busting your butt as a volunteer. So thanking them is a really important piece of that. All right, so wrapping up here. If you want to recruit and maintain and retain these volunteers, start off with your volunteer plan, right? And then match your volunteers with their interests. Empower your volunteers through education and accountability. Accountability you might not think of as empowerment, but it's really important that if you say you expect something from a volunteer, that you're going to follow up with them and hold them accountable. And if they continue to not follow through with what they said they're going to do, you are realistic with them and have healthy boundaries and say, okay, well, it seems like you're having trouble with this. Can I help you? You know, don't cut them off immediately, but then saying, this is what we expect. This is what we need for our co-op. You know, when you have the ability to follow through with this, I'd love to work with you again. And then also figure out who will stick with you. Get commitments, make sure that people stick to what they're saying they're going to do. And as I mentioned before, the long-term community leaders who see themselves there in the future are going to be really good volunteers for your co-op. And as we mentioned before, college students for short-term projects like a survey or something, fine. Almost anything else, just say no and save yourself some trouble. And part of the co-op difference is having these invested volunteers, these huge amounts of people that will come out to make this daunting project a success. So use your volunteers well, and the more that you can strategically plan from the very beginning, the more likely you are going to be to retain these volunteers and to have fun. I mean, that's part of it, right? I like to volunteer someplace where I know that I'm going to get something out of it and have fun. And so I think volunteers have fun by being able to connect, by the relationship building, by getting fed, right? By getting thanked, by getting to meet cool new people. So the more that you can demonstrate and promote that volunteering for your food co-op is fun, the more you're going to get people that will be drawn to you and will stick with you.
All right. Bonnie, can I ask you one last question?
Absolutely.
So why did you join Monadnock Food Co-op?
Oh, man. You're going me at the end like that. No. I was actually the first member owner of the Monadnock Food Co-op. And so I joined because I was a graduate student that had moved to Keene, New Hampshire. I didn't know anyone there. And when I was getting ready to start my master's degree, there was nothing, I was trying to think of something that would really make a tangible difference in the community. And one of the biggest concerns was the aging farming population and the lack of year-round stable markets for the farmers in the region. And so another big concern was that all of the class, I became close with the students that were a year ahead of me in school, and I noticed that almost every single one of them, besides 2, left the community because there were no jobs. And so these 2 pieces kind of wove together, and that's how I got involved in organizing and being the project manager. Was suddenly it clicked for me, like, wow, starting a food co-op would meet a lot of these unmet needs in the community. And so, and I wanted to create a job for myself. I wanted to be able to stay in the community. And that, so that led into why I joined. The board surprised me and got me the first membership in the co-op after we had finally done all the bylaws and gotten all the things in order. So that was, I joined in the best way possible, which was that the startup volunteers came together and helped put everything together so that I could join.
Thank you for being a good sport. And I want to mention that Monadnock Food Co-op did open about 3 years ago and has been a phenomenal success and a model throughout the country ever since. They continue to be wildly successful, to be constantly adding new projects and doing new things, and really be a center and a hub of community in Keene, New Hampshire. So not only did they get it open, but it has exceeded expectations, has won awards. It's really a terrific co-op. So I want to thank again, and Bonnie, if they have questions, where do they get a hold of you?
Right here on the co-op. And the website should have my contact information, and I'd be happy to talk by phone. So give me a holler.
Okay. Well, we want to thank again Bonnie Hudspeth for joining us today. She's volunteered her time to come out and share this information with the Food Co-op Initiative audience and those who are organizing in the community. We're so grateful to her. Thank you, Bonnie.
Thanks for having me. Rock on,
right.
Startup Organizers.
All right. And that's a wrap. Thanks, everyone.